Just looking at the effect of vacuum, because I've seen very little discussion by NASA about the effect of vacuum when in space, whether it's at the International Space Station, let alone on the moon, because the effect of vacuum is quite severe on material manufactured here on Earth, because you get outgassing, not just of water, not just of liquid, but you get outgassing of material, of metals, aluminium, magnesium, and such like.
You need a calculator that actually calculates the force of the vacuum, and here is one.
Okay.
We're going to select the unit that we're working with, and we're going to come down here and we're going to find the torr in the thing. Right here, we're going to go area, square inches. So now we're into pressure per square inch, so PSI. And that's what people understand. And then the calculated force, we're going to go pound-feet of force. So 760 torr is 1 atmosphere.
That's 14.7 pound per square inch.
Area, we're going to put in 1 square inch. So now you have 760 torr. 1 square inch is 14.69 pounds-feet of. So when you start getting into space, if you have 10 to the minus 1, you have minus 10. That is the amount of force, very little force. 10 to the minus 2, you add 1 more 0, you still have very, very little force coming in there. 10 to the minus 3, which is the edge of space, you now have 19.3 pounds of force per square inch. 1 atmosphere is 14.7, and this is right at the edge of space. When you hit 70 miles up, you are at 10 to the minus 4, and now it's 193 pounds of force per square inch. Now you hit 5, and then we go to 6, and there is the number you're looking at, and that's exactly why the Sandusky chamber has a 150-ton door on it and 10-foot thick walls, because that's the force of the vacuum inside that it's having to deal with, plus the 1 atmosphere on the outside. You still have to add that 1 more atmosphere on the outside. But that's exactly showing you the force of the vacuum itself. This is why they can't build a spacesuit today. That's why the Artemis program failed. The physical craft that they're putting up as a capsule just to go, that's only 130 miles off the surface of the Earth, has to be as strong as the Sandusky chamber, because the force is per square inch, so it's based on surface area that you're dealing with. So the Sandusky chamber is 150 feet across inside. It has 10-foot reinforced walls on it. So you have 1 to 15 ratio of it. If you come down to 15 feet across, you still need about a 1 foot thickness of wall to deal with this pressure here at only 130 miles up. When you go out farther, you add 1 more 0 to that, and the number's going to be quite absurd. This force right here that you're looking at is the limit at which you can use any kind of rubber seals on. After you go past this, you have to use steel on steel. They use silver on copper as a knife edge and carve it in to create the seal. That's how they do it in small chambers in laboratories where they're pulling that kind of a vacuum. The thickness of the walls are based on the surface area. So when you take the diameter, you're looking at a ratio of 1 to 15. That's how you design spacecraft. That's why a small tube running through won't collapse. When you're 150 feet across, you need 10 feet of walls just to deal with this much pressure. And this calculator is the only one that calculates the force. That is why people need to understand that.
Very interesting.
But like I say, I have looked and looked and looked at other calculators, and they simply fail. This website has for all different kinds of calculations on it. It even has weight to acceleration and everything else in here. You can actually take the weight of a rocket and calculate the acceleration that it's going to have based on the amount of thrust that it has as well.
Now that third column, that calculated force, that's measured in pound per square inch, isn't it?
Here's the measurement is the middle.
Okay.
So its area is 1 square inch. If I change that to square meters, if you like, then you see how big that number gets.
That number is a minus figure, isn't it? Negative.
Yeah, because the torque scale is 10 to the minus.
So that's a minus. So in effect, there is virtually no pressure exerted outwards.
Right. And NASA refuses, or any science people refuse to say that a vacuum has suction or pulls or does anything. They refuse to admit the fact that a vacuum has a force, because they just say there's nothing there, so there is no force. But this calculator is showing you in the torque scale the force.
Yeah.
And it doesn't say it's not a force, and it's not this, and it's not that. It is a force. And if you were to put your hand over something, they say, oh, well, it's the air behind it. It's the differential of the two that creates the force. And if there's nothing in space, then there's nothing to have a force against. But when we put a capsule into space and it has an atmosphere inside it, there's going to be a force. And I mean, even the demonstration of people putting a pop can inside a small vacuum chamber, at the very best they're pulling 10 to the minus 3. Pop cans are rated at 90 psi. That means you can put them out in the sun and they heat up and they still don't explode, right? You take a pop can that's got 10 or 15 psi in it at room temperature, you put it in a vacuum chamber and it explodes. And they claim that it's only equivalent to 1 atmosphere difference, because they're looking at the psi scale, not the torque scale. They're looking at the psi scale, so it goes from 14.7 to 0. And they think that's a perfect vacuum. Well, even at this level of torque, you're not at a perfect vacuum.
I was doing a talk in London about 15 years ago at the 14 times unconvention, that's what they call it. 14 times. You know 14 times the magazine, named after Charles Fort, who wrote about all sort of weird and wonderful stuff. Anyway, when they started, they used to have conferences, and they called it, because they're 14 times, the 14 times unconvention. And about 1,000 people in the audience. It was quite big. It was a big theatre in London, and I was doing a talk there on conspiracies, as was my wont. After I did my talk, this chap comes up to me, somebody in the audience, and he said, I'd like to have a copy of the talk, because I had it all typed up and it was all official. So I gave him a copy of it, and he said, well, in exchange, you might like this. And he gave me this piece of moon rock. I said, what's that? He said, it's a piece of moon rock. Now, if you remember, about 20 years ago, some joker managed to wheel out of the NASA headquarters down in Houston the filing cabinet that had all the moon rocks in it.
Oh, right.
They got very, very upset, and they arrested him, and they got all the moon rocks back, they said. Now, I don't know if that's true or not. What I might have is one of the rocks out of that collection. Now, I'm saying that's possible. I don't know if it's true. I mean, the idea that somebody can walk into the Johnson Space Center and wheel out on a trolley a filing cabinet about 6 foot high, weighing about 300 or 400 kilos, that would be quite difficult to get. And he put it in the back of his pickup and drove off with it.
You pretend you're there. It doesn't matter if what you have to do. You put on the costume, the shirt, whatever. You walk around with tools. It doesn't matter what it is. You walk around there, and the security will come up, and they'll ask you what you're doing. And you just say, oh, well, just fixing this, or changing a bulb here over in room 3. Or they don't even question you, because you got the bulb in your hand, you got your tools on, and you're just going about your business.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably how the guy did it. Isn't it funny how people think, it's almost like they think that they took 400,000 people and just packed them all into that 50-acre lot that they have out in the back, and they're all working there.
Yeah, I know.
That's what they think.
I think they're all in touch with each other. They're all talking to each other. In my talks, I actually make the point about that. I say, how do 400,000 people keep a secret? They don't. They don't need to. There's no secret to keep. Because if you've got Boeing up in Washington State, Lockheed down in California, Grumman over in New York, the launch site in Florida, Johnson Space Center in Texas, they're thousands of miles apart. How do people get together? I said, just imagine you working in an office with maybe 200 or 300 people around you, and I've worked in offices with about 200 or 300 people. You don't know what's going on in that office. You certainly don't know what's going on in the board of directors meeting where they're making decisions about how the company's going to operate. You don't know that. The three largest organizations on the planet are the Chinese Army, the Indian Railways, and the National Health Service in Britain. The National Health Service in Britain employs about 1.2 million people. Indian Railways employs about 4 million people. Chinese Army is about 6 million. Do you really think that every single one of those people in the National Health Service know what all the other people are doing? Of course you don't. I don't even know where the idea that 400,000 people, who certainly worked for Apollo in all the various companies, though I do have a doubt about that, because it's always said that there were 20,000 companies under contract to NASA. They were thousands of miles apart. The guys in New York making the lander weren't talking to the guys in Washington State making the rockets. Ask any young person, do you believe people have landed on the moon? They say, not a chance. Never happened. Which indicates that possibly they thought for themselves enough to be able to work it out, or they're seeing the complete nonsense that's going on now in 2022 when NASA are desperately trying to get back to the moon. For God's sake, why don't they use what they used 50 years ago?
There is no back to the moon. There is only to the moon.
To the moon.
If they get there, it will be for the very first time.
Yes, it will. But NASA cannot admit that. Now, that is probably why NASA are having such terrible trouble right now, because all their good engineers, their good designers, their good staff have moved across to SpaceX, Blue Origin, and are working there under much more favorable conditions because they're not beholden to the whole NASA narrative.
Because they haven't done anything to cover up yet.
No, exactly.
They're not going to be able to fool people this time because they're going to be watched all the way.
And NASA know that people are watching. And that is what worries them.
That's why they're very quietly saying, oh, we're going to send it down to the private sector. And you know, like saying that they're $22 billion over budget and stuff like this, and that the delays now are unknown.